Antoine, welcome to FO Podcasts.
Well, Atul, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you for your time. Those of you who are tuning into this episode of FO Podcasts should know that my guest is Antoine van Agtmael. Have I got your pronunciation correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Brilliant. Now, Antoine is an investor, he's a philanthropist, he's an author, he's a Renaissance man. He's a Dutchman who is also an American. I believe you have dual citizenship.
I do.
Brilliant. So, a truly cosmopolitan individual, a transatlanticist in many ways, and a man who coined the term emerging economies.
Emerging markets.
Emerging
yes.
markets. Okay, emerging markets. I stand corrected. So, without further ado, Antoine, how do you see the global economy shaping up over the next year or two, and maybe over the next decade or two?
Okay. Well, let's start with the next 2 years. I think we will see a period of stagflation. That is to say, inflation that in some countries is now 10, other countries 7, 8%.
Yeah. Eurozone is 10.7, I read.
Yeah.
The last I read.
That will slow down to probably some 5%.
Mm-hmm.
But it will be combined with a much slower economy than we have seen these last years. So that combination is often called stagflation.
We are going back to the 1970s. I remember reading, of course, I don't remember that time, but I remember reading from my economics textbooks and books and, of course, various papers back at Oxford about the 1970s, and stagflation was really hurtful.
Yes. This stagflation, I think, will be different. Different in the sense that we are not going to see inflation of 17, 18% for a period of time.
Before you say it'll be different, paint a picture, especially for those who are younger, as to what the 1970s was like.
Well, it was a brief period of several years that in the United States and other countries, you saw inflation suddenly rise to 15+%.
Was it thanks to the 1973 OPEC?
I think that had a lot to do
oil
with
hike.
it. Yes, that had a lot to do with it. You could even say it was one of the major causes.
Yeah.
And so very dramatic action was needed. And that action was led by an American central banker,
Paul Volcker. Yeah.
Whom
I met, who was a remarkably impressive human being.
He was.
Yeah, he died.
He was.
Yeah.
And he recognized that in order to get rid of this economic cancer, he needed basically economic chemotherapy. And that economic chemotherapy was very high interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
And so I say it's not going to be like that, because I think neither the inflation nor the interest rates will be that high or that bad. But it will still be stagflation. In other words, little, no, or even negative growth combined with something like 5% inflation, not just for a few months, as the central bank here, Fed, originally thought, but for a couple of years. Because once inflationary expectations have become anchored into the mind
I found this on the web.
of people, then you get this type of phenomenon.
Brilliant. Now, those of you who heard I found this on the web was the telephone going rogue, just as Sarah Palin once went rogue. Anyway, I remember vividly this from my reading, and I have asked this question when I was teaching political economy in Berkeley. I was teaching global political economy, and I asked this question: who killed Keynes? Was it Milton Friedman? Was it Ronald Reagan? Was it Margaret Thatcher? Was it stagflation? Was it guns and butter of the 60s that led to massive deficits? But the point I was getting to was the 1970s were also stagflationary because in the period coming up to the 1970s, central banks had been a bit loose with their monetary policy. and governments had been a bit lax about
Yeah.
their fiscal policy. And we are in a similar situation today.
First of all, I think that Keynes didn't get killed, but wounded.
Wonderful.
And that academically, the person who did it undoubtedly was Milton Friedman.
Not Friedrich von Hayek.
There's never, just as Keynes can claim credit for all of his ideas, I think Milton Friedman can claim credit for all of its ideas, or for that many
or even Friedrich von Hayek, because
Right.
of course he was greatly
Exactly.
influenced by the Austrian school and von
exactly.
Mises.
It's part of it. So I think that changed, but don't forget that a Republican president, Nixon, around that time said, we're all Keynesians now.
Yes, he
So
did. And in
his
1973, he took the dollar off the gold standard.
Right.
I know that very well.
And did price controls.
Yes, and did price controls.
So I think his influence is still there, but I think economics has moved on.
But on a serious note and a less academic note, over the last few years, central banks have followed quantitative easing. I have met people in various central banks with grave reservations about it. They do not say so in public, but they are worried.
Yes,
I have met people...
for good reason.
Yeah, and I have met people in governments, and I'm sure so have you. Some of my friends are in government, some of them are in politics, who have grave reservations about spending more than their governments earn. And they say politically it is suicide if you cut too deeply. But they are very, very, very hesitant about making the tough choices.
Right. I think,
And most people are worried now that inflation has come in, that would we see the unraveling of these last few years of excessive spending and excessive printing of money?
yeah, of course, it all started, I'm afraid to say, under Trump and his bill to basically cut taxes,
But
which created an imbalance. I
that's
think,
fiscal
already.
policy.
That's fiscal policy,
Yeah.
but that all has an impact.
Of course it does.
And then, of course, it was followed by the pandemic when, let's face it, the government needed to do triage. And when you do triage, you know that not everything you do is going to be right. I think that when history is written 10 years from now, people will say that Biden should be very grateful, even in these elections, for Joe Manchin, who stopped him from basically giving in more than was necessary to what you could call the left wing of the Democratic Party. And as a result of which a lot of money was spent. I personally think a little bit too much money was spent, but at least not even more money was spent, because that would have made it worse.
Understood. So the next 2 years, we are going to see stagflation.
Yes.
What happens afterwards? What is your prediction?
After that, we will again see, unless we get some global conflict, we'll see the stock market booming back. We'll see the economy moving back up again, and inflation coming down to an acceptable 0 to 2% range, I think.
All right. So
I'm not pessimistic in the long run.
In the long run.
Neither do I believe that we're moving toward any kind of depression or major economic crisis. But we are moving into, in fact, have already moved into a difficult phase, but not as difficult as the 70s.
And certainly not as difficult as the 1930s.
No.
All right. Now, after 2 years, you see growth. Now, that brings me on to my next question. Where will this growth come from? Where are the bright, shiny spots in the world which will drive these growth? And you've written a book. I reviewed the book. I found it a fantastic book. I didn't agree with all of it, but
Who would?
but I learned a lot.
The smartest places on earth.
Exactly, the smartest places on earth. Brain belts, not rust belts. So, since you've already done the work, where are those places which are going to drive growth?
if we're talking about the United States, and growth is not going to be driven just by the United States,
But it will be a key driver in
it
your
will
view.
be one of the key drivers.
I
yes.
see.
If we're talking about the United States, we're talking basically about what always drives growth, which is technological change.
Yep.
And that technological change will come not just from the triangle of Boston, Silicon Valley, and Texas. It will come from inside that triangle as well. Much more so than people believe.
So you mean places that you've written about, like Akron, Ohio, the polymer capital of the world,
Or Albany.
Batesville, Mississippi, Albany,
Yes, you name it. There's a
even
whole,
Boise or Idaho.
or for that matter, Indianapolis. So, what is interesting, and it's too early to look through the results of the midterms, but already in 2020 and now again in 2022, you can see that it is in those kinds of places that actually the Democrats did better than expected and the Republicans did worse than expected, because there people could see that things were actually starting to improve.
Understood. So the US will be a center of growth, and it will be the smaller places where cheaper rent and a history of expertise in a particular technology that'll drive growth. Now, you've also talked about your home country.
Yeah.
And Eindhoven is one example, and you've given examples of Saxony in Germany.
Yeah.
You've given other examples too. So outside the US,
Sweden, in Finland,
Lund, So outside
or Israel, for that matter.
Israel, of course, is a startup nation,
and that's just talking about the developed world, on which
exactly. So in the developed world, what would be the centers? You haven't talked much about Italy, of course, or for that matter, Spain or Greece or Portugal. So in Europe, and let's say, and in the developed world, which would obviously include Israel, maybe Taiwan, maybe Japan, where do you see growth coming from?
In very short, I believe that the countries, the cities, and the companies that will prosper will be those that will embrace what I would call the age of electricity. We are leaving the age of fossil fuels, and we're entering the age of electricity. And so,
hang on a minute, electricity has been around for a while.
Yeah.
So
it has been around for a while.
So what do you mean by that? You
for
mean
example,
how electricity is generated, perhaps? You mean it'll be generated not just from coal and used. Okay.
And used.
So please walk us through this.
In order to basically bring down the increase in temperature on Earth and keep it within 1.5% is already not possible, but let's say 2%.
2 degrees centigrade.
2 degrees, so not 2%. I'm a financial person, I think in percentages. 2 degrees. There are things that have to be done. And among those things that have to be done is that the sources of energy have to basically move from fossil fuels to electricity. Now, we of course have been using electricity for a long time, but we haven't been using it for cars or for planes or for trucks. And I think cars will be the first one. And that's going very fast now. It finally is going very fast now. And the trend here is clear. Now, using electricity for cars means that you have to get it in a different way than we're getting it now. Because if you get it from coal, you make things worse rather than better.
Exactly. Because you're better off using public transport instead of cars.
Yeah. And of course, that's only possible, again, because of technological change. And people forget that wind, solar in particular, are now really competitive after the price has dropped some 80%. So you don't need subsidies anymore for this.
They're competitive.
They're competitive, more than competitive, in fact. That's one. The second is that we have to start thinking about nuclear in a very different way. Nuclear in two different forms. Basically, the current form of nuclear, which is fission. Making smaller reactors and more efficient reactors where the waste is recycled in a more efficient manner. Everyone from Bill Gates to other people are working on that, and you will see that come about, I think. But the other area is nuclear fusion, which
has been a lot in the news.
Yeah, it's only at the very beginning. And what is interesting that actually China is here ahead of the rest of the world, followed by Korea.
Or is that hype?
No, what they have shown is that they can make this reaction last longer than anyone else has been able to thus far. In other words, they have been able to create what you could call a secondary sun for longer than anyone else so far. Now, Korea is hot on its heels. Princeton is hot on its heels.
Absolutely.
That race will change, but there are a number of people working on it. How fast that will become a reality, I don't know. Will it be a major source within the next 5 years? Probably not. Could it be a major source, a significant source in 10 years? That's open to question. Will it be a major source longer term? I would bet yes. So that's a second major source of energy that is not polluting and that doesn't create global warming.
But, you've talked about the supply side, but in the supply side itself, we'll get to the demand side too. In the supply side itself, you need better storage if you're using solar or wind. It's more sporadic. You need better transmission. If you can cut out losses in transmission, then you make things which are huge. Simple things. So we've walked into a building here in the US, and one of the things that I'm amazed even today when I fly from Europe to the US is the amount of inefficiency in every building when it comes to heating and cooling. So, but
the US thinks itself wrongly as being ahead in every technology. And that's very far from the truth. And when it comes to energy and a future use of energy, and particularly in saving energy in buildings and other places, Germany, Holland, Northern Europe in general, most of Europe is significantly ahead of the United States.
So supply side, you see further changes. And then on the demand side as well. If human beings could become more efficient.
Right. And a third major change, which I think is important also for other reasons that I'll go into, we have to go away as much as we can from transmission altogether.
Understood.
We have to generate the electricity in our own homes, in our own cars, in our own gardens. And that's not just some kind of pipe dream anymore. It is quite possible.
Now, I mean, people have solar roofs, and in India you can generate quite a lot of electricity, and you can generate quite a lot in Africa too. So
I was just on a boat.
Yeah, boats have it too. I have a friend whose boat has solar panels.
On a Dutch-type freighter on a canal in France. And we had several solar panels that provided, not all, but significant amount of electricity. Why we are not doing that is crazy.
Is it capital investment?
No, it's mindset.
I see. Now, we've talked about the supplies.
And let's say, as we're moving into it, there's a period that people have to, it's not just a mindset, but people have to be trained on installing it, which a few years ago on the eastern shore of Maryland, you couldn't do, by the way.
Why not?
People didn't know how to do it, or they didn't want to do it.
I see. So you've talked about the supply side, and we've touched briefly on the demand side. On the demand side, where do you see the great savings coming? Because that is essential too. Quite often, you have people just talking about the supply side and saying, oh, we'll have fusion, and then once we have energy, we can have clean water, we can have some version of Voltaire's El Dorado. But the point I always make is that excessive consumption and inefficient consumption and excessive demand is also not a terribly good thing. That can help too.
Who are some of the big energy users?
The
Buildings?
US.
Well, let's not talk about countries. Let's talk about
All
categories.
right. Buildings.
Buildings?
Sure.
We already talked about that.
Yes.
They can be made far more efficient. Cars. They can be made
Cars are very inefficient.
far more.
Yeah.
I mean, an electric engine is so much more efficient, uses less energy,
Less moving parts.
less moving parts.
Yeah.
Plenty of other areas.
Mhm.
Industry. I remember talking with cement manufacturers about energy use and the need to save energy. And one of them had said to his people, one of the major cement companies, okay, within the next 2 years, I want you to save 30%. He himself didn't believe that this was actually possible. In fact, well within 2 years, they saved 30%. In other words, it's quite possible to save energy if you put your mind to it. The most important reason why we are not doing these things is the mindset. It's not capital.
Very interesting take. And then let's get on the mindset. If it is the mindset,
Not the only one, but the major one.
if it is the mindset, then do you see, for instance, the per capita and the net largest polluter in the world, the US, changing? And if so, who will be the drivers? Will it be private businesses? Will it be citizens? Will it be mayors? Will it be governors? Will it be the federal government? Because this is a dispersed society.
I don't want to be wishy-washy, but the answer is all of them.
Okay.
And the more it is from the bottom up rather than the top down, the better.
The more sustainable.
And there is a good chance that if we look back 10 years from now, that we'll see that 2/3 of the initiative came from the bottom up and 1/3 from the top down. However, that pressure from the top down is what stimulated the bottom up.
Or maybe it's a feedback loop. Maybe it's a feedback loop.
But without let's say, the academic world recognizing what needed to be done, and certain politicians, not all politicians, pushing for this, it wouldn't have happened. Once that started, then states, cities, private enterprises, entrepreneurs, academics all got into the picture to make this possible. So on that score, I'm actually more optimistic than I was maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago. Not that we can fix the problem sufficiently, but that we can mitigate the problem in really material ways.
All right, brilliant. Now, we've talked a wee bit about the US driving productivity, and we've talked about the areas in terms of the geographical areas.
And if I may interrupt, I've spent a lot of time thinking about productivity. And it has become quite clear to me that we actually don't know very well how to measure productivity. My belief is, and that's a whole long discussion, that our productivity is actually significantly higher than we think. And that the productivity in countries like China may actually be a little smaller than they think. So that actually the difference in growth between these two may not be quite as big as we think. That's a geopolitical aspect of it. But why do I say that? The truth is, and even the Bureau of Labor Statistics will admit that, is that we're not very good at measuring basically technological change. We try, but we don't quite know how. I mean, we all use Google. What a tremendous change that is in productivity. That is not being measured. Google Map.
There's all debate on this, about whether we account for the extraordinary efficicy gains of using Google Maps from getting A to B.
Well, we don't know how to measure it. For example, now we know how, but some years ago we didn't know how to basically measure the productivity improvement in an iPhone from iPhone 1 to iPhone 13.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there were incredible productivity improvements.
Mm-hmm.
We just didn't know how to manage it until someone said, well, let's look at eBay.
Mm.
And an old iPhone is worth less than a new iPhone. So you can see there how that productivity moves.
Mm-hmm. All right. Geographical areas within the US we've covered. But which sectors of the economy? You've written extensively about it. You've talked about additive manufacturing. You've talked about new materials. You've talked about... actually, I'll let you talk about it. You've written a book about it.
Yeah. Well, there are a number of areas. Clearly, robotics will make a significant change, because what makes robotics possible? What it makes possible is to make most things in most places at a cost that is not very different from other places. Basically, the idea that you can bring back your father's manufacturing, which was, let's face it, the Trump idea, that I don't believe in. But what is possible is to produce through robotics, through the use of new materials, etc., in the United States, in Europe, in most other places, in highly efficient ways. And that makes it possible to have economies that are more self-reliant and are more resilient than they used to be. We went all out for low cost and efficiency, and we forgot about the need to be self-reliant and resilient.
Yeah. And COVID
and
proved that.
has now changed. COVID
Proved that.
certainly
Made
us realize.
Yeah.
But also the fact that our world has gone from one that was moving toward globalization to a world that is now deglobalizing.
Friendshoring, nearshoring, all these terms have come into being.
Yeah, as a result of that, people have started to think differently about this.
So you mentioned robotics, that's one. You've mentioned new materials, of course. You've mentioned the combination of chips, software, and hardware.
The whole area of healthcare, medicine, from oncology to replacements of antibiotics to the replacement of really brutal treatment like chemotherapy through immunotherapy and all kinds of other new treatments. All of that is, and the fact that you now can do operations, robotically, and the fact that a lot of it can be done at a distance. You don't need to see, the doctor doesn't need to always see you in person. A lot of it can be done at a distance. All of that is bringing about a revolution in medicine and healthcare. That is the type of revolution that is still led by the countries where thought control is at a minimum. And we're talking here mostly about the United States and Europe. I'm not saying exclusively, because China has done better on technology than I had ever imagined. But they are in the lead because in order to do that, you need freedom of thinking.
All right.